Um, we'll start off with some introductions as more people are kind of joining us. So my name is Kyle. So I'm from Wichita, Kansas. I'm part of USMB leadership for youth ministry. And so we're kind of like in this weird stage. So the past couple of years, we've been called USMB Youth, dealing with youth and teenagers and things like that. But we're kind of changing our brand to USMB Next Gen. And that's partly because we're kind of expanding into more leadership development. We have things like a national camp that happens every year called Adolescents for high school students. But then we also have a youth worker network where we kind of talk a little bit about networking youth pastors together, whether it's full-time, part-time, or volunteer. And then we also just last year developed what we call the leadership pipeline, which is helping people find their calling, particularly in the ministry, that provides internship opportunities. And so we're kind of rebranding a website and all that. So right now it's still usmbyouth.com, but soon in the next couple of weeks, we'll actually be usmbnextgen.com. So that's kind of where we're at. Yeah, so go ahead and just put your name and kind of where you're from in the chat. So in just a moment, we're going to have Serena share a little bit about herself and all that. But throughout the presentation, she'll go ahead and share the screen, and she has some graphics and kind of overall content on there. But if you want to put in the chat any questions you have during her presentation, there'll be moments that we'll stop for some Q&A, and you can kind of ask verbally then too. But just so you can kind of remember and kind of stay ahead and keep up to speed, if you will, just put any questions you have in the chat, and then I'll pull them out, and Serena, who is all-knowing and knows everything, will be able to answer every question fully and completely. No, but Serena, really quick. So Serena and I have known each other for about 8 years now. She works and volunteers and helps teach part of youth ministry that I run at Ridgepoint Church in Wichita, Kansas. But I'm really excited because, in the past year, a lot of change has happened for Serena. But Serena, could you share a little bit about where you are now, and then where did you come from before this year?
Sure. Well, I am now a professor and director of the social work program at Tabor College. I'm a licensed master's level social worker. And so I've actually worked in the field with children and families going through crisis through the foster care system for the last 23 years. And so I made the decision last summer to step into a new chapter of my service, and excited to work with young people. I love to do that in my volunteer work, have a real passion for young people and for women and for families. And so now I get to do that with college students seeking a bachelor's degree in social work. And I also teach part-time at the University of Oklahoma in their graduate school program with their master's level students. So I just taken on a new challenge, which is always fun for me, and I can never have enough. So
there you go.
That's me in a nutshell.
Well, we're excited that you had a chance to share with this. This kind of been in the works for USMB Next Gen for a while now. And I think all can agree this is a pretty relevant topic, particularly with today's teenagers and how vastly it's different than it was 20 years ago when this technology just didn't exist. But before we get to that, I do want to ask one question and kind of ask all the kind of the teachers, what are you passionate about, Serena? What's the one thing that you would say, man, this fuels me?
For me, it would be children and families, like in general, as a broad conversation piece. That's where I go. I desire to see families be really healthy. And so if I can help parents do that, parent well, and help teens make it through and kids make it through childhood healthy, then they can create healthy generations in the future. So for me, it is about what we do today impacts multiple generations in front of us. And that is my passion.
Awesome. Okay. Yeah. I'm always curious on how people answer that question. So thank you for answering that. And I would say, take it away. It is now your show. Go ahead.
Awesome. Well, I am just glad everybody is here. I am going to share my screen here, and I will tell you as I get this going that today might feel a little bit more dry, a little bit more overwhelming. I am a professor. I'm not a creative person by nature, so I don't create the most exciting PowerPoint presentations probably, but I'm going to give you a lot of really good information that I think will be helpful to you. Kyle, can you see the presentation okay? Okay. So when we started talking last fall about this conversation, we were talking through, you know, what do youth workers need to know when they're in the room with a young person and the young person is sharing their heart, they're sharing their life experiences, and how does a youth worker know how to respond to that? How do we understand all these complexities of what it means to be a teenager? There's a lot about being a youth that is very similar across all generations, decades. Like, it does, some basics don't change, right? Like all the conflicts we have as a teenager to decide who we are and where we fit in the world and what we're passionate about, what we're excited about in life, dealing with stressors of learning new skills, learning to date, learning to interact and communicate with other people, and learning to make decisions and make wise decisions. All of these are pretty similar, but there are some unique differences and challenges that come up for different generations of young people. And right now, what we see is mental health, mental wellness, being a big topic that our young people are dealing with. And I think part of that is because we as adults have made it safer for young people to talk about their challenges and the things that really weigh them down, the things that create this sort of heavy cloud over them. So that's a positive. But while we've made it safe to talk about it, we haven't necessarily educated our young people to really understand what it is they're dealing with. And so when we talked about how do we equip youth workers for this, I really felt strongly that we needed to start from a place of shared understanding. What's going on when we talk about mental health with young people? What does that mean? What does that look like? And so that's kind of where we're going to start this week. Next week, then, will be a conversation more about skill building. How do you respond when a young person is sharing with you? How do you discern, is this something where I need to get other people involved because it's more serious? Or is this something that I can support in that pastoral youth worker, small group leader kind of role, just as a positive relationship with a young person? And so we'll talk some more next week about skill building and how to know when to take what sort of action. So that's kind of the plan for the next couple of weeks. So as we get started here, let me make sure I can. So we're going to focus in on probably the two most common, quote, mental health diagnoses or clinical terms that we see in young people. This is not all inclusive. We see depression and anxiety being the two that young people are most commonly going to talk about. Those are the words that your young people will use. But both of those terms are really kind of limited in a young person's understanding of what they are. There are other mental health concerns like bipolar disorder, ADHD, not oppositional defiant, that is one, but obsessive compulsive disorder. These are also mental health challenges that we see young people dealing with at a greater frequency now, especially coming out of the pandemic. But I chose to kind of hone in on depression and anxiety. And I just want you to know, like, you can reach out to me. You can find me at Tabor College. My website or email, phone number, all of that is on our website. You can reach me through Kyle at any time. So if you have a particular question or a particular concern about something that a youth has brought to you that you ever just kind of want to talk through with somebody, I'm available to do that. And I'm happy to have that conversation. But we're going to focus in on depression and anxiety here. So in order to do that, it's really important for us to understand when we talk about the mind, we are really talking about the brain. And so it's really important for us to have a really basic level of knowledge about what the brain is doing and how it plays a role in this. And so we're going to spend the first few minutes here just looking at our brains in general. And one of the things that I teach young people and all the time is there was a guy named Dan Siegel who created what we call the hand model. So if you hold your hand up and you fold your thumb in, that would be like the center of your brain. Your wrist area would symbolize the brain stem. And then as you fold your fingers down over the top, you're going to be looking at all of your lobes of the brain and the cortexes of the brain. So if you can kind of imagine that your brain, as you grow and develop, it grows from the bottom up, so brain stem all the way up to the top cortexes up here, and then from the back forward. So from your occipital lobe, your vision develops before your ability to make decisions, right? And then from the inside out. So there's 3 different growth movements in the brain that happen over time. And the most significant time of growth for the brain in human development is ages 0 to 5. Hi, Carrie, good to see you. Ages 0 to 5. So if anything happens in ages 0 to 5 that cause disruption to that, what we would call typical growth and development of a child's brain, we know the brain's development over their lifespan is going to be negatively impacted by that. So any sort of prenatal exposure to drugs or alcohol, any sort of prenatal exposure to trauma, say through like a domestic violence situation, if mom is super stressed out because of circumstances around her life, family dynamics, couples dynamics, financial stressors, anything like that. If mom takes a lot of medication while she's pregnant, any trauma that mom experiences with a difficult pregnancy, all of that is going to impact that infant's brain development even before they're born. And so that's really important for us to understand and remember, because when they're 16 years old and they're sitting in our youth group, we may not know all that took place for them even before they were born. And yet those factors are still playing out in what we see in the youth group. So 0 to 5, really, really important brain development opportunities there. And anything that takes that off track of normal, whatever that means, right, is going to impact that person for the rest of their life. It is overcomable, it's manageable, but it's going to be a factor we have to pay attention to. So when we think about our brain, and you can imagine your hand, remember, you want to remember that the different parts of the brain are responsible for different things, different parts of our day-to-day functioning. The brain stem, this wrist area, that's responsible, or on the screen here, it's the light blue, this part here. This is the part that's responsible for keeping your body alive. That's the part that handles your heartbeat, your lungs, that everything works properly, that your diaphragm goes up and down, that your stomach digests things when it's supposed to, that you eliminate when you're supposed to. That brainstem functions all the time without you ever thinking about it. It's what keeps you alive. Just above that then is this little bit different color blue, the occipital lobe. So that's where your vision information is processed. So as you take information into your eyes shoot it all the way back to the back of your brain processes it, and it sends the information all the way up through the front to actually tell you what it is that you're seeing. The center, the yellow part here that you're looking at, the temporal lobe, this is the part like right above your ear, right? This is the part that talks to you about memory and understanding and language. So words are deeply connected to memories. This is why you can often remember what somebody was saying or the song that was playing when certain events happen in your life, or you can remember lines of movies and music really easily, because that's all happening in your memory and language center of the brain. Just above that is that parietal lobe, which is all about your perception, you're making sense of the world. This is where you're kind of processing the information and sorting it out into categories, if you will. If your brain is like a filing cabinet, the parietal lobe is the different folders within it where you've categorized all of your experiences and what they mean. Your sensory cortex, that little orange part, is the part of your brain that tells you what you see, hear, smell, taste, and feel. Your 5 senses are located right there in the center. But notice, if you remember, up and over and back forward, your sensory cortex comes a little bit later in the process, right? That you can fully understand all those senses. So that's why we have to teach children the stove is hot. If you touch it, it burns because it's hot. And so we're connecting now the emotion, the feel, the heat, the burn to the word hot and the feeling of pain, right? We have to teach kids that as they get older. The motor cortex then comes next. That's all of our movements, fine motor movement, gross motor movement, and gross is like your big movements, your hands, your legs, and your arms and your whole body moving. Fine motor would be more of your fingers and your toes and being able to grasp small objects. And then finally, and it's particularly important for us, is that frontal lobe. And this is the part right behind your brain, your forehead, that helps your brain learn to make decisions. So all the information that all of those other parts of the brain have collected gets sent forward, and your frontal lobe is responsible for figuring out what to do with it. It is the last part of the brain that becomes fully developed. And we're going to talk more about that in just a moment. This is where you make decisions. This is where you make good or bad decisions, and you categorize your decisions into those areas, right? This is where you learn, oh, last time I did this, I got that result. And so this time I'm going to try a different result. But it's all happening in that frontal lobe, this prefrontal cortex up here, where you're making those decisions. Are there any questions about the different parts of the brain, just to start with? Okay. So now I want to talk about what's happening in here in the center part of your brain. This is what we call the limbic system. This limbic system in the brain is kind of buried underneath all those lobes and cortexes, but this is the part of the brain that helps us to control our fight, flight, freeze response. This is the part of the brain that helps us to control our emotions. And so when trauma happens of any sort, when we get off track in that normal development in any way, it's this part of the brain that is directly impacted by all of those changes first. Because remember, we go from inside out. So this part's going to be impacted before this part is impacted. The hippocampus, that blue area that you're looking at there, that is responsible for a lot of release of hormones. Your amygdala is what triggers your fight, flight, freeze response. That's what kicks your body into gear the way God intended it to do. Your pituitary gland and your hypothalamus, they release a lot of hormones and chemicals through the brain to kick the parts of the brain into gear and into action when they need to be. So this center part of the brain is critically important when we start talking about mental health and mental illness or mental health challenges, because it's the part that we need to work on, but it's also the part we can't see. It's also the part that we don't understand. When we see a behavior, it's this part that's triggering the behavior, not this part that's triggering the behavior. And we often want to address behavior by talking to the kid about why you did the thing that you did. If this part of my brain has not been fully developed yet, and this center part of my brain is the one that's triggering everything, that's shooting off all these chemicals and hormones and telling me what to do, if I ask a teenager why they did something silly, they're not going to know, because this part of the brain is not activated. If we have depression and anxiety on top of that, what we know is that this part of the brain and this center part of the brain are actually not connected. The neurons between them are not firing the way that they should. And I'll show you that here in just a little bit. So I wanted to show you this graphic just to help remind you that your brain is not fully developed until your mid to late 20s. And so this is one reason why it can be really, really frustrating for parents of teenagers, because you're looking at this young person who now looks like an adult, right? Their body has developed in a way that they look more like an adult. For boys, you hear that deeper voice. It's more like a man, right? So we want to see and behave and interact with them like they are adults. Their brains are not adult brains yet. They won't get there until they're about 25-ish. which is why a lot of parents say they did not get along with their young people when they were teenagers, but once they hit that mid 25 to 30 age range, now, oh yeah, now we can go on vacation. Now we can hang out. Now we can really enjoy one another. And that's true, because now you're operating on the same sort of level from a neurological standpoint. Up until that time, there's a big disconnect there. And so it's really hard for parents to be looking at one kid, but parenting the brain that's inside them. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so let's talk about, and we'll come back to all that brain stuff here in just a minute. So let's just talk about some data real quick. Let's paint that picture, right? So we know how the brain develops. So let's figure out when do things kind of go awry for us? We have some data from pre-pandemic, and we're just now starting to get data from official mental health capacities for during the pandemic. So this first slide I'm going to show you is some information from our CDC from 2018 to 2019. And at that point, we were looking at about 15% of 12 to 17-year-olds being diagnosed with a major depressive episode. This is an episode, not a long-term kind of diagnosis where they're in treatment. It's that they had something happen within that year that met the criteria for an episode of major depression. So these young people would have been diagnosed by some sort of provider, a mental health provider or a physician. At that same time, we saw that about 78% of all children ages 3 to 17 who had diagnosed depression were receiving treatment. So that's good, right? That's almost 80% of kids who have a diagnosis are in treatment with someone. We don't have a lot of data about what type of treatment, if that was that they were in counseling or they were on medication or both. But we know that they were seeing some sort of treatment provider in general. We have almost 40% of young people reporting during that 1 year before the pandemic, almost 40% were reporting persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness. Keep in mind, that's pre-pandemic when I tell you about the post-pandemic. We had about 4% of young people in our country experiencing a substance use disorder, which means they were addicted to substances. They were receiving some sort of support for substance use, alcohol or drugs. About 18% had a seriously considered attempting suicide at some point. 18%. That's almost 1 in 5 young people. 15% of our young people had actually made a suicide plan. They had thought through how they would take their own life. Almost 9% had actually attempted suicide, and about 2.5% of those attempts required medical intervention. So when we talk about attempting suicide, that could be anything from the young person who starts slicing their wrist open, takes a bunch of Advil thinking that's going to kill them. They do something, but it doesn't require that level of medical treatment. The medical treatment would be a young person who attempted to hang themselves and were found choking or unconscious, a young person who had taken substances that did cause them to pass out and go unconscious, and they needed to have their stomach pumped or things like, or a young person who had injured themselves and they were bleeding out and needing medical attention in that way, or any other number of attempts. Just so you know, if you hear a young male talking about suicide, you need to be aware that men are more likely to choose more volatile means to suicide than females are. So men are more likely to engage a weapon, and males are more likely to engage a weapon. Girls are more likely to do things they think won't hurt. They want to go to sleep first. Okay, so just keep that in mind. About 59%, about 60% of young people, children ages 3 to 17. So we got to think children is in this too, with anxiety receive treatment. So 60% with diagnosed anxiety were getting treatment. About 53% of young people with behavior disorders were receiving treatment. And here's what we know. Young people who have challenging behaviors are often brought in for mental health treatment because of the behavior, not because of a concern about their mental health. So they're too aggressive, mom brings them to therapy because they're too aggressive. They're using drugs, mom brings them to therapy because they're using drugs. And it's during the therapy process that we learn that they have a mental health component that's at play here. But they're usually brought in because of some behavior that adults are concerned about. Okay, so now let's talk post-pandemic, right? Because we had a rough couple of years, and truly young people experienced the largest disruption in their daily routines than any other population on the planet, especially here in the United States, because we went from everybody goes to school every day to everybody stays home every day. You had parents who used to be at work every day, were now at home every day. And so lots and lots of disruptions in children's daily routines. So in March of last year, and this is the CDC put out data for 2021. So all of data is always going to be at least 6 months to a year behind. So in 2021, we saw that more than a third of our high school students reported experiencing poor mental health during the pandemic. That's self-report. Young people said, yes, I'm struggling. Almost half, about 44%, reported feeling persistently sad or hopeless during the previous year of the pandemic. This is going through all of those changes. They felt persistently sad and hopeless. And I want you to remember too, what was social media like? What was the news like? What was everybody talking about around the dinner table? These really sad, scary, hopeless kinds of scenarios, and kids were hearing all of it. More than half, about 55%, reported experiencing emotional abuse by a parent or other adult in their home. And this is all self-report, so teen perspective, but they reported being sweared at, insulted, or put down, right? Now, imagine you are the parent who's lost your job, your spouse lost their job, you're trying to pay a mortgage, you're trying to make sure your kids have health insurance, you're trying to homeschool kids you've never homeschooled before, you're trying to do all these things. So your stress level is like up here. Everything about your life has changed too. And what happens when parents are really stressed out, right? We snap a little bit easier. We're more irritable with each other, with our partners, and with our kids. And so it's not surprising to me that we would have more than half of young people then reporting that they felt like they had experienced these things during the pandemic. The truth is that number is not far off from what we see outside of the pandemic either. About 70% of young people who come into foster care in the United States actually come into foster care because of neglect of some sort. Emotional abuse is often a part of that. So keep that in mind. We're not too far off in that regard. Children's perception of what is happening in their relationships is a very big deal. Okay, just over 10% experienced physical abuse by a parent, and some of those same dynamics are at play. If I'm super stressed out as a parent, it is way easier to push my buttons and I can respond in a way that I normally would not respond. It's easier for me to lose control if I'm super stressed out, and the pandemic introduced a lot of stressors no one was prepared for. About a fourth, or a little bit more than a fourth, of young people reported that a parent or another adult in their home had lost a job, which means the financial stressors impacted our kids in a big way. We saw kids have to quit their sports, their music, their drama, their activities, the things that were helping them to stay connected within their communities. Kids had to stop those because parents couldn't afford it anymore. When you have to move because you've lost your home, you got evicted, that's stressful. Now your school has changed, everything about your life has changed even more, right? If you don't know if you're going to be able to eat because your family can't get food access to food quickly, that creates challenges. So we see a lot of impacts of the parent losing a job. And then I know this is a population that our churches often struggle with understanding and knowing how to respond to, but it is important for us to understand that youth who would put themselves in this LGBTQ category and females actually do report poorer mental health more frequent abuse, and having attempted suicide far more frequently than youth who are not in those two categories. So that's just something for us to be aware of as youth workers. If that's something that our young people are struggling with, we need to know that they are at an increased risk, and we need to respond to the risk as much as we are responding to anything else. Okay. Do you have any questions about the data or the brain development piece at this point? Am I missing anything in the chat yet, Kyle? Okay. Are there any questions? Okay, I know I'm going pretty quickly, but there's some other stats here from the American Psychological Association post-pandemic. In 2020, we saw that about 71% said that the pandemic had taken a major toll, and 69% of them had said the pandemic had been the worst thing that had happened to their child. That's huge, right? That's a parent perspective. And then this was also really interesting to me. Just from March of 2020, when the pandemic really hit in the United States, to October of that same year, we saw emergency room visits for mental health related needs increase by 31% for ages 12 to 17-year-olds. That's huge. 31% in 7 months. If that doesn't tell us we need to pay attention, I'm not sure how else we're going to get prompted to do so. Okay, so I'm going to bring all that together. So all that brain information I talked to you about, how the brain develops. This is the picture of a PET scan from a brain without depression and a brain with depression. So if you look at the, can you guys see my mouse when I move it? Okay, so this center right here would be that limbic system, the amygdala, the hippocampus, the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, that's all happening right here in the center. Oops. And so you can see how that is firing in this picture, right? If you come over to this picture of the brain with depression, it's also firing in a slightly different pattern, right? But what do you notice about what's happening around it with all of those other cortexes and lobes in the brain? The brain without depression seems to be functioning properly, right? The brain with depression, though, it's not. It's just not firing, right? So this piece here, this would be more of that sensory cortex, the temporal lobe. So they're taking in information, but this person doesn't have a clue what to do with all of the stimuli that they're coming in with. They're just stuck because their fight, flight, freeze center is firing. They're taking in the sensory information, the words, the language, the memories, and they don't know how to respond to it. So a person with depression literally can't decide what to do because their brain's not functioning in that moment the way that it was intended to function. So here's a couple more brain scans. Okay, here again, you see the person with depression. This dark spot here is the connection between that limbic system and their prefrontal cortex, which is all of this up here at front. So when this big void is happening, this person can't make decisions here about what's happening in the rest of their brain, okay? This is the brain of a person with OCD. The brighter the color, so all of these reds that you see, that is an overactive brain. So a person with OCD, when we see them engaging in all of these pattern behaviors, like, oh, I have to check the locks 5 times, I have to drive back by my house 18 times to check that the garage door is closed, all of that, it's because they're trying to take in enough data to show their brain that, yes, I closed the garage door. Yes, I locked the front door. Yes, I washed my hands enough, right? But notice here, we still have those little voids happening. So there's something in this prefrontal cortex of the brain that's not clicking into gear to say, okay, done. That piece of our to-do list has been dealt with. In bipolar, notice you have everything firing and this center part of the brain is on fire. Like it is constantly agitated. It is like you're standing in the pit of snakes in that Indiana Jones movie. Everything is going at one time. All the parts of your brain are taking it all in. Nothing is shutting off. Nothing is regulated. Nothing is in control. And so you are all over the place. So a bipolar person, we used to call it manic depressive, right? So you will have moments of hyper productivity, hyper engagement with the world around them, hyper, like everything. I'm on it today. And then you have a crash because the brain gets tired and it can't do it anymore. And so it literally crashes. And that's what creates that cycle in the bipolar, in the person with bipolar disorder. Kyle, there's
a question.
You see that?
Yeah. So pretty much, the question kind of is, okay, the brain scan of a person with depression is similar to early development then?
Yes.
Kind of look at the pictures, and then Brady mentioned the limbic system is meant to keep us alive, not happy. When that part of the brain is running, it shows everything as a threat. Do you want to share a little bit about your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree 100% that limbic system is meant to help keep us alive. Remember when we were first humans on the planet, right? We didn't have safe little houses, like we were living outside. After the fall, for those of us that are believers, after the fall, we lived in an imperfect world, right? Where animals would now attack us. We weren't just safe because we were in perfect creation. And so now the amygdala has to kick in to literally tell us there is a lion by you. Do you see what I'm saying? So it has to kick you into gear so that you can move. And a person with depression, your amygdala is firing, but you can't then do the action you need to come out of that and to get away from the lion. So, yeah. Okay, anxiety here. Notice how similar anxiety is to bipolar. Anxiety is everything is firing at one time. But again, you don't know what to do with it. They get stuck because look, right here, you see this, the connection between the limbic system and that prefrontal cortex. We see it firing, unlike over here, where there's no firing, right? So this person likely knows the truth about what's happening around them, but they can't make the choice to actually move their body to deal with it in a particular way. So they get stuck. It's their brain is firing, but not all the way in terms of letting them make that decision, letting them be in control. And so then they get overwhelmed and they get stuck in this, I have so many options and so much data I'm taking in that now I'm overwhelmed. And it would be like the entire, if it were one lion, I maybe could get away. I could maybe shoot it. I could deal with whatever I need to do, right? But if it's a whole pride of lions and they are surrounding me, where do I go? What do I do? I can't scream loud enough, right? And so that's that person with anxiety. It's like everything around them is attacking them. The bipolar person, their brain is working overtime to get it all done. The anxiety person is overwhelmed by everything they're taking in. Is this making sense? Okay. So now let's look at some body chemistry. So when we talk about depression, what we're really looking at, the brain is all managed by chemicals, right? There's there's hormones that go through the body. There's neurotransmitters that take signals from this neuron to this neuron that tells the body what to do. It's like those bridges between the connections. All of that is chemistry, and I am not a neurologist. I am a social worker, so if I get any of this wrong, I'm sorry. But what we know is that in the brain, when you are stressed, your brain releases a hormone called cortisol. This cortisol floods your body, and it prepares every cell in your body to respond to the stress. So it kicks everything into gear, right? If you are depressed, you have cortisol flooding through your body all the time. So what happens is it kind of builds up this resistance to where then your brain is so overrun by cortisol that it actually begins to shrink because now the brain is not getting the different exercise that it needs to discern between different scenarios. So we see that an increase in cortisol in the body over time can actually shrink the size of the person's brain, the gray matter in the brain, as well as the hippocampus. That amygdala, the limbic system structures are all shrunk as well. So they're just not working. It's like they've been firing for so long and now you can't respond to it. So why keep firing, right? The amygdala, actually, that one little part of the limbic system does get bigger because now it's trying even harder to get you to pay attention to it, but nothing else around it is working, right? So we've got a brain now that is kind of fighting against itself. The breathing patterns of a person with depression do change. They tend to get a lot slower. The breath isn't as deep. And so now the oxygen in our body is changed. And that impacts our body's ability to function properly. A lack of oxygen to the brain also impedes its ability to function. Our cognition is changed because we're not getting enough oxygen up here. Right? So think about where your lungs are and how they have to distribute oxygen through the whole body. It has to come up and out. And this is one of the very last places to get it. So if you're not getting enough oxygen because your breathing has changed, then you're not going to be able to think as well and make good decisions. There's some serotonin. There's older evidence that says that serotonin, which is a natural mood stabilizer and is a neurotransmitter in our brain, there's some older evidence that says serotonin plays a big role in depression. There's some newer evidence that says maybe it's not as big as we thought. But we do know that some of the medications, some of the most common medications we use to treat depression are what we call SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And they actually act to keep your brain from reabsorbing this neurotransmitter so that there's plenty of it left in the brain to actually transmit the signals throughout the brain. Because the brain will naturally sort of release it, let it do its job, carry this message to this part of the brain, and then the brain will reabsorb it. So the medication works to keep the reabsorption from happening so that there's enough serotonin out there to carry the messages. Does that make sense? Okay. New connections, in order to treat depression, new connections actually do have to be formed in the brain. So this is why I said those early impacts can be overcome and managed, but it takes time because now we have to build new connections in the brain. And so that's why it's really important for people with depression to be receiving perhaps medication and therapy. The therapy works to build the new connections through skill building. There are some common causes of depression. Again, I told you serotonin might be a big one, but we're still kind of checking that out. There's some newer information that says it may not be as big of a factor as what we initially thought, but that's still being researched. Trauma, genetics, lots of other factors biologically and environmentally also come into play. We will see a greater number of young people, well, people of all ages diagnosed with depression because of the pandemic, because there were a lot of environmental factors. There were a lot of medical factors at risk or at play here. So we will see those numbers go up over the next 3 to 5 years. There's also a real connection with depression between your emotions, your behaviors, and your thoughts. And this is why cognitive behavior therapy really works for folks with depression, because it helps us to engage the temporal lobe, the sensory lobe, and the cortexes, the prefrontal and frontal cortexes of the brain. We get all of those firing together in cognitive behavior therapy, and now we can connect it to what's happening in the limbic system. And so we are actually establishing new neural connections in the brain through the therapy process. So it's really important to get them into therapy. And CBT is by far one of the more successful treatments for depression. So what depression is not? It is not sadness based on what would be typical or expected, like grief. My parent died, I'm sad. You might be depressed in that moment, but it's not clinical depression, that's grief. Now, if it persists for 2 months, 6 months, a year, now we're talking more about clinical depression that was started in grief. But so we need to help young people understand that depression and just intense sadness are different. and we want to talk about them differently, and how we work with it is different. Depression is not a bout of sadness that is short-lived and doesn't change behavior. So for example, a person who is sad but still goes to all their football practices, still plays 100% in the football game, that still goes to class, still does all their homework, turns everything in, has the same group of friends, engages with family, but they're sad, that's probably not depression. That's sadness. And we need to figure out what's making them sad. We need to talk about it. We need to be aware of it because it could turn into depression, but it's not depression yet, right? Because it hasn't significantly changed everything about their life. And depression is also not just a lack of motivation, either due to feeling overwhelmed or just feeling stressed out, or just being a teenager and high school is hard and I'm done with it because I'm a senior. Right? It's not just being not being motivated. It's, I can't do it. I know I need to do these things. I have the ability, but I can't get out of bed and go to class today. It's just not going to happen. And that happens all the time. Depression has some very unique criteria, and really, I'm not going to read all these to you, but I want you to know that in order to receive a diagnosis of depression by a therapist, and I'm sorry, that's a little bit small. I'll make sure you guys get all this in email too. You have to have at least 5 or more of these bullet points, and you have to have them for at least a 2-week period, and you have to have either the depressed mood or a loss of interest and pleasure in everything else in your life. So it's a unique kind of perfect storm of symptoms to be qualified as a clinical diagnosis for depression. That doesn't mean that if we only have 3 of them, we don't respond, we don't care. It means that we're not to the level yet that insurance will pay for treatment, right? So providers have to get creative in that. It means we still have to respond, we have to provide support, but we may not be looking at someone who needs every week therapy and medication, and we need to be in support groups, and we need to have them under 24-hour watch with their parents and things like that. It means they need help, they need support, we need to be paying attention. We're just not quite to that clinical level yet. Okay, any questions about depression specifically before I move into anxiety? And I am noticing my time, so we'll get through it, I promise. Okay, so anxiety is different from depression, like we saw in the brain scans, right? Because depression involves a few chemicals in our body. Anxiety involves almost all of them. Everything is firing. Everything is on high alert with anxiety. We have serotonin, that mood regulator, that natural mood stabilizer. We have GABA, which is a neurotransmitter that helps us regulate our nervousness and anxiousness in the body. We have epinephrine, norepinephrine, endorphins, dopamine. All of them are involved. All of them are firing and flooding the body all at one time in anxiety. The Mayo Clinic actually has some really good information about anxiety out there, and rather than retyping it all, I screenshotted it for you. I'm not going to go through all of these, but I do want you to know that some of your risk factors are trauma. So any of your young people that have experienced something traumatic, i.e. all of them, because they've all lived through the pandemic, that's trauma. So that's a risk factor for all of our kids right now. But anytime you have divorce, in the home violence, you have any sort of abuse or neglect situation, extreme poverty, extreme neglect, those kinds of things, that's all trauma, and it's going to increase the risk of anxiety. Stress due to illness of themselves or a family member, right? Someone close to them. Anytime you have kids that have a lot of stress building up over time, I know in my experience as a small group leader, I have kids that are involved in every activity they possibly can be. They're taking all AP honors classes. They're trying to accomplish, 2 full years of college in their last 2 years of high school. And the stress buildup leads to anxiety. It's because it's too much. Remember, for a still developing brain, it's just too much. We have to encourage young people. You don't have to accomplish all of your life goals by the time you graduate high school. It's okay to take it at a slower pace. It's okay to move through things slower and more methodically. Personality, some people are just more likely to have anxiety than others because they're just naturally more nervous. Introverts, people who do not like to be in front of people, do not like to be in large crowds, do not like to be super social, are by and large more susceptible to anxiety than extroverts. Anytime you have another mental health challenge going on at the same time, you're more likely to have anxiety. It's just anxiety is comorbid with a lot of other disorders out there or diagnoses. Anytime you have a blood relative with anxiety or you're using drugs and alcohol, you're also at an increased risk. So some symptoms to watch for with your young people: anytime they feel really nervous, restless, or tense, like they're constantly stressed out. If they have a sense of impending danger, like those kids that are really worried about going to camp because something is going to happen to them or something's going to happen at home. Anytime the kid's heart rate gets really going and they're not like exercising, running around and being kids, if they're just sitting there and now their heart is racing, that's a symptom of anxiety. Hyperventilation, sweating, trembling, hand shakiness, hand tremors, got to watch for that. Or the kids who you'll see them sit in youth group and they're fidgeting with their hands pretty nonstop, or their legs are bouncing nonstop. These are good clues of something to just kind of, okay, I need to just kind of be aware that kid, because their body is moving in response to all the things happening in the body. Okay, I'm going to share this with you so you can look at it, but all of your phobias are anxiety, all of them. Because it's this intense fear that I can't get beyond, right? So I'm gonna let you guys look at that. But okay, so some important things to remember with anxiety, and I'm gonna kind of do an is not and an is side by side. Okay, so anxiety, a clinical term of use of that term, is not a fear that is typical, normal, or expected. You put me on top of a tower for a zip line, I'm having fear. That's not anxiety. I'm just terrified. That's normal to be scared when you're that high up. It's normal. Anxiety then would be uncontrollable fear. Like I cannot move. I am literally frozen, cannot move. And I have it in situations that are not normal. I have that kind of fear response when I'm not at the top of the zipline tower. When I'm standing on the ground, I'm totally safe. I'm not even wearing a helmet for the zipline. And now I'm freaking out. That could be more anxiety, right? Anxiety is not rational. You are not going to get a person with anxiety to think calmly about their anxiety. It's not rational. Remember in the brain scan, I told you way back here, the person with anxiety has everything firing, and yet they know it doesn't make any sense, but they can't control it. So anxiety is not rational. Anxiety is truly irrational. It truly doesn't make any sense to them, and they can't figure it out. Like it's just like they don't know what to do with it. They are literally stuck. It's not a choice. They can't just turn it off. You can't just tell them, oh, calm down, it'll be okay, and expect that they're going to be okay. This is the person that needs to be walked through a process to get it to the point that they are okay. But you're not going to tell them, don't worry about that, and expect that they're going to be okay. It's not an occasional worry. It's an intense, uncontrollable worry and catastrophizing, which is making the smallest thing like the end of the world. That's anxiety. So it's not the same for everybody. Every person can experience it differently. And two people living in the same house experiencing the same stimuli can experience anxiety very differently. So anxiety is very individualized, and we need to be aware of that too. What worked with one student that we're seeing may not work with the next student that we work with. So we have to be flexible, and we are going to build up our toolkit so we kind of have a few things that we can pull out when needed. Anxiety is not something to be ignored or washed over or just like left alone, so let them deal with it. It is something that truly needs to be attended to. Because the person who is anxious, if they are ignored and walked away from and said, okay, you just take some time and deal with it and calm down and you come back when you're ready, that's going to make them more anxious than actually one person, not the whole youth group, one person kind of sitting with them and saying, okay, well, we'll sit here, we'll wait, and you're important and I'm going to be here and we'll walk through it together. If they're in a true panic attack kind of scenario, they don't need to be alone at that point. One, you want to make sure that they don't fall and hurt themselves, that they don't throw up, that they don't hit their head, there's a lot of physical safety that needs to be monitored during a panic attack, but because they are going to feel like they're dying. A panic attack genuinely feels like a heart attack. And we see a lot of people go to the emergency room every year thinking they are having a heart attack, and the doctors diagnose it as a panic attack because the heart is doing, it's just on overload, but it's not doing cardiac arrest. So feels very much like they are going to die. And so they need to know and be reassured in that moment that they are okay, that you are there and you are going to help them with whatever happens during this moment. So, okay. So one tool that I do want to give to you today, just in case you can't come back next week, is that there is this thing called mental health first aid training. This website that I've given to you, mentalhealthfirstaid.org, actually has several different trainings that you can go through. Some of them are online, some of them are in person, and so you can kind of choose with what works best with your schedule. And there's a lot of providers that do this training. This is just one website. But mental health first aid, on this particular website, they have several different versions. The youth version would actually be for people who work with young people who are interested in knowing how to respond during a mental health first aid scenario. Like, this kid is having a panic attack. What do I do with that? This kid is telling me they are depressed and suicidal. What do I do with that? So there's some mental health training there. And then there's a version for faith and spiritual communities. This might be something good to share with your pastoral staff, to share with your volunteers throughout the church, because people in all areas of ministry are going to experience having someone share these with them, these struggles. And so we need to make sure that people are prepared across the board. And so that particular version, as I understand it, tries to educate faith communities on how do we talk about these things within the context of faith, but without turning people away from it, right? And really acknowledging it. So next week, I plan to give you some real specific tools and tips that you can use when you're with a young person who is talking about suicide, when you're with a young person who's having an anxiety attack, or when you're seeing that in them, some things that you can say, some things that you can do, and some tools you can walk them through, or some skills you can walk them through during that moment. So, Kyle, are there any questions in the chat? I can stop sharing.
Yeah. So there's no questions in the chat, but we just, if you want, we just have a few minutes. If anyone has any particular questions, like I said, it's kind of like, okay, what do we do with this information? That's really next week in this, but we wanted a clear grasp of understanding is like, where does this come from? In order to better handle, okay, now what do I do about it? So any other questions? Yeah, go ahead, Shelley.
Yeah, Miss Shelley.
Hey there. So when I was looking at those brain scans, we were doing that more with depression, but I saw one for anxiety too. Was I understanding correctly that like the wrong parts are lit up, but it also kind of connected back to the developmental stages? Like, is it almost like it's not developed all the way yet?
Yes. So remember, the brain goes from the bottom up, right? Inside out and back forward. So there's 3-dimensional development going on. So when that amygdala, that part in the center, is over firing, the parts around it have to be able to respond to it. And so let me pull up that first graphic again, so you guys can see that okay.
Hey, Serena.
Yeah.
One thing I wanted to add on that was, I see what you're saying, Shelley, on that, but the big difference is the amygdala. The amygdala is running the show versus when it's developing. That it's the amygdala, or that part of the brain isn't running everything. So it's like when that part's fired, everything's aligned.
Yeah, and if you think about that infant, right, that newborn baby, they have the ability to tell when they're hungry, when they're tired, when they're scared. You know, you have those reflexes that we get from babies. That's because this part is pretty well developed at birth. It's the rest of it that physically it's there, like the whole brain is there when a baby is born, but its ability to function is what's still developing. So the brain, all of this gray matter up here, this is all made up of those neural connections. And so my kids are really into Marvel, right? So you got like Doctor Strange and these kind of characters that if you can imagine the brain being like this hand and this hand are both neurons, right? Then there's this zap of energy between them. That's this neural connection that says, okay, this is my stimuli. This is what I do with it. It's this connection here that's not developed at birth. The ability to fire off the response from the amygdala is developed at birth. What do I do with it is not. And so when go ahead.
When we're interacting with a teen that has depression or anxiety, you know, our expectation can't be that that connection is happening.
Correct.
So is this an oversimplification probably to say, like, as I think about younger kids or how they were when they were younger, we have more patience and our expectations are different because we know they're not going to make that connection right away.
Right.
And
we
so
take
we
the
have to
time
kind of like bring that into our.
Yeah, we have to take the time to teach them, okay, you're angry right now because sister took your toy.
Right.
But we can't hit sister because she took our toy. So we teach a connection there, right? Between here's the stimuli and here's my action response. When they're teenagers, we've stopped doing that for some reason. Okay.
Well, and they don't respond to the teaching as well because we don't know how to do that at an older age without being condescending, you know?
Right. Yeah. So it is important to say, and you can show teenagers these pictures of their brain and talk with them about what's happening.
Right.
Teenagers love to take that kind of information in and feel like, oh, they are just as frustrated with what they don't know and what they're not able to do well and how they're not meeting your expectations as you are. No one talks to them about here's what's happening in your brain. When I sit down with young people, I will often say to them, do you know what's happening in your brain when you're telling me that you're feeling depressed? Do you know what's happening there and why you can't feel like you can just snap out of it when you're having a lot of anxiety in a week? And they're like, no, I have no idea. So if I can talk to them and I can teach them, here's what's happening in your brain. And you're right, you can't just shut that off. And that's okay. That's really empowering information to help anybody, young person, old person, doesn't matter. But if we can understand why we can't just choose to shut something off, it's really empowering. And now we've given them new language too. So now they can come to you as a mom and say, Mom, you know what? I think I'm really overstimulated right now and I'm just overwhelmed and I don't know what to do with my to-do list because I've got, 4 tests this week and 3 papers to write. You're telling me to clean my room. I've still got to go to practice and I have to do all my laundry because I'm out of clean underwear. I don't even know where to start.
And I'm like, welcome to becoming an adult. And they're like, not helpful.
So instead of, I get you, Shelley, like I have 4 young people, like I get it. But instead of going to that, okay, figure it out, because I've got my own set of stuff I'm overstimulated by, right? When my kid has the language to come to me and say, Mom, this is everything on my plate. Now I can say, okay, well, let's get a piece of paper. Let's write it all down and let's figure out what has to be done today and what can be done tomorrow. What's gonna cause a major catastrophe in our life if we don't accomplish it right now? What's urgent, right? We teach our kids time management skills, organizational skills. We teach them to navigate through those kinds of stimulations, and they now have the language to deal with it.
Yeah, it's like the difficulty in being able to set a priority. Everything seems important at the same time.
Yep, absolutely. And for a kid with anxiety, that's going to be your biggest struggle. A kid with depression, this is why medication can be really helpful, because the medication does help to allow a more efficient use of that brain chemistry to get you to a place where you can talk to them. Remember, in that depressed brain, it's just not working. It's just not, it's just not turned on. And so the medication helps to turn it on so that you can now have a conversation with them, because the parts of the brain that are needed for conversation and planning and intention is what needs to be turned on here.
So with anxiety, I'm assuming the medication sort of shuts down the parts that are going too crazy. Does it turn on anything else, or do you need to pair that with something?
No, because anxiety, everything is firing already. And so what makes it really tricky for healthcare providers, for psychiatrists and medication providers, is that your anxiety meds tend to regulate, kind of bringing everything down, while your depression meds want to ramp it up. And so what makes it difficult to find a medication combination that is really successful is finding one that releases at the time so that you get to this perfect sort of balance in the brain, right? And that can be really frustrating too for the person who's struggling and challenging, because they feel like it's just exhausting, constantly having to make adjustments, and it can sometimes take an entire lifetime, years, to figure out the right medication, and then it may work for 6 months, and you have to change it again.
Does depression always come with anxiety, or are they sometimes together and sometimes not?
Sometimes together, sometimes not.
And then
often together, but not all the time.
And then do people like come to a place where they don't deal with it anymore? Or is it always a lifelong thing?
That really depends on the cause of that person's struggle. So if it's more genetic, biological, they may have to struggle with that most of their life. If it's more situational or circumstantial, like I experienced a trauma and now I'm having anxiety and depression as a result of a specific point in time kind of trauma that I can point to, but through therapy processes, through healing, through Bible study engagement, whatever, I'm now at a place where I've dealt with my trauma and I understand it differently. I may be able to come off my medication and see my depression and anxiety sort of self-regulate, because I've built the skills and the connections in my brain to handle that appropriately. But the person where it's more genetic, it's more biological, that may be more of a lifelong kind of challenge.
As the teaching comes, the connections start to develop, kind of like we're learning to ride a bike.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. And the thing about the brain is all of those connections, they have to be used over and over and over again to stay there. The brain goes through a process called pruning, where if I learn this thing, like if somebody teaches me one time to make tacos, but I never make tacos again, 5 years down the road, I may not remember how to make tacos because I didn't use that skill over and over again. Right. So the brain goes through pruning and it kind of cuts away and makes room for new connections.
Thank you.
Yeah. Good questions.
Wow. It's a lot to digest, but we really appreciate you, Serena. And again, like Serena mentioned, if you have any questions, you can email us or bring them next week, because next week we'll kind of unpack this, like, okay, what are we supposed to do with this information as well? So we're gonna wrap it up here, but I want to say thank you, Serena, in sharing that, and thank you for attending. And so we'll meet same time, 12 p.m. Central Time, right here, the same link. So just use the same Zoom link, and we'll see you next week. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.